Drake London goes off, and will it mean we'll get a high-flying, explosive Falcons offense in 2024?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs wind down. These sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka the Iron that sharpens the iron, aka Mr. aka, and I've been covering the Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I think each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers, that means you make it your first watch or your first listen each and every day. And shout out to you. And if you want to become an everydayer and get another shout out, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we'll talk about should guys play in the preseason. We'll talk about, Brandon Dorlus also getting maybe some looks to help alleviate some of the concerns for the Falcons edge rusher concerns. I was hoping today's episode, though, would be all about Justin Simmons, but alas, we'll have to wait, maybe indefinitely. But instead, let's talk about some tweets, right, from today's practice. A spirited practice. And our first one comes from my good friend Maria Martin. All you need to know, Drake London is on fire at practice today. Woo! Kirk to Drake looks fantastic. Will McFadden of AtlantaFalcons.com added today is the best practice of the preseason for Drake London. Dude looks like a monster downfield. And then Tori McElhaney quote tweeted Maria's tweet and saying the DBs were swarming Drake on Monday. Definitely didn't make it easy on him. Looks like he took that personally today. So clearly the Michael Jordan meme is going strong for Drake London. And so that means we're bringing it back.
Drake! Drake! Yes!
It's been so long. Been so long. But it clearly wasn't just Drake London. It was others. D. Orlando Ledbetter of the AJC says it's Deep Ball Wednesday at Falcons practice today. London, Pitts, and Hodge showing out. One bad drop from Darnell Mooney, which, of course, is music to my ears. It fuels my anti-Darnell Mooney agenda. No, I'm kidding. But, it's nice to see the explosiveness in the offense. And we have another tweet from Joe Patrick of 92.9 The Game, and I'll just read the last part of it, talking about the deep ball stuff. He says, I began covering the Falcons in 2022 with Mariota's arrival, and safe to say I've not seen before what I'm seeing in this camp with the downfield passing being a legitimate threat for this Falcons team. Connecting on shot plays are something we thought we would be central to a successful Arthur Smith offense that never materialized. This team will have far more success in that department. And so I think that's a great point, right? I think the key to raising the ceiling for this offense is, explosiveness, right? Explosiveness matters. There's 3 things in this world that matters: Black lives, special teams, and explosive plays. And I'm sure there's going to be somebody angrily commenting all plays matter in the comments, but you do you. But like I've talked about it many times before on the podcast, explosive plays are going to be a multiplier. They're jet fuel for your offense. The stats that I've been collecting over a decade that say basically you're going to be 3 to 4 times better on offense when you generate explosive plays, whether it's moving the ball into scoring range, scoring points, or even just getting touchdowns with those explosive plays. And defenses are basically built with the idea like the worst thing that we can do as a defense is give up a touchdown. The second worst thing that we can do is give up an explosive play because it's easier to score touchdowns after you generate those explosive plays. And so obviously it's opposite true for the offense. Best thing we can do is score a touchdown. The second best thing we can do is generate an explosive play because it makes it easier for us to score touchdowns. And we're going to believe that Kirk Cousins is going to help with the team's ability to generate those explosive plays, especially down the field. We've talked before this offseason that Kirk Cousins doesn't throw deep that often relative to the other quarterbacks in the NFL. Is like bottom 3 over the last couple of years in Minnesota. But in terms of his ability to hit those deep throws, he's near the top of the league, maybe even top 3 at that number. And while Kirk doesn't always have the prettiest deep ball, like when you just are just marveling at a deep ball, you look at Michael Penix's deep ball, you look at someone like Jaden Daniels' deep ball, and you're like, ooh, that's so pretty. Kirk is more like Matt Ryan. Like, it's not always pretty, but, it gets there, right? Even if it's a little bit underthrown at times, but as long as it's connecting, it's a good throw in that. That's one way where it's results over process, I guess you could say. So, I think London is going to be that guy for the Falcons in this offense. Even though Darnell Mooney plays the X wide receiver role that is typically in the Sean McVay offense, the deep threat is going to get a larger percentage of those opportunities. But as I've discussed many times before, I don't think Darnell Mooney is a great deep threat. As in Drake London is, right? Even though Drake London doesn't necessarily have that vertical speed, but that contested catch ability to win, in the air, I think is going to allow him to generate more of those explosive plays. But I will push back a little bit with one of the things that Joe said in that tweet where, I think he's right when he said shot plays were so important with Arthur Smith's offense, because I think that was a big part of what they needed, because they didn't really have that sort of intentionality that I've discussed many times when it comes to play calling, meaning that you're calling a play with the intention. The intended outcome of this play is to generate an explosive play, right? Outside of those obvious shot plays, under Arthur Smith, whether this was in Tennessee or Atlanta, Smith's offense wasn't really cooking up plays that were intended to be explosive. It was a lot of like we saw last year where you run a screen to Jonnu Smith and he breaks it for a 60-yard touchdown, but you're not going like, man, we need an explosive play. You know what we should do? Let's call a screen pass. That's not, something that you normally would do. And that was something that we talked about at the jump of hiring Arthur Smith. And, the question was, would he really develop that or add that to the Falcons offense after several years of Dirk Cutter and Steve Sarkisian as the play callers that weren't really adding that sort of intentionality to the offense, which was the big thing that was missing from those teams after Kyle Shanahan, who was very big. That's like the defining characteristic of Kyle Shanahan's offense, which is the intentionality of the ability to dial up explosive plays. And, for Cutter and Sark, when they needed a big play, they often just were just throw the ball to Julio and let him do his thing, as he, is one of the most explosive wide receivers in NFL history. Him and Megatron are 1 and 2 in that regard. And obviously Shanahan, of course, benefited from Julio's presence while he was there. But you go back to those 2016 games against the 49ers, against the Rams, where both Julio and Mohamed Sanu were out of lineup. The Falcons offense was just as explosive without those guys, with Taylor Gabriel and Zac Robinson, due to that intentionality under Kyle Shanahan. And so, the thing I'm pushing back with what Joe's saying is I don't know if the shot plays are going to be that critical to this offensive success as they were with Arthur Smith, because he lacks that intentionality, because we don't know if Zac Robinson is going to have that intentionality where if he's like, oh, I can scheme up, a 25-yard play, on some crossing route or some over route or something like that, that doesn't necessarily mean we just throw a go ball like it often was the case with Arthur Smith when he was looking for those things. Now, we don't know if Zac Robinson is good at dialing up and designing those plays, right? He's never called plays before, right? So the question to me, one of the big questions that will get answered over the course of, the next 5 months is, where does Zac Robinson sort of fit on that scale, that spectrum between, a Sean McVay, a Kyle Shanahan, who's very good at, the intentionality of the explosiveness, versus a Dirk Cutter or a Sark or an Arthur Smith, who are just okay. That was my thing. They're not bad play callers because they lack that intentionality, but it's likening them to mid-tier quarterbacks, right? And Andy Dalton, the Baker Mayfield, and Alex Smith, etc. Right? We win with you, but we're not winning because of you, right? And I know in the past I compared Arthur Smith to Kirk Cousins, but that doesn't really fit my current narrative with the current construction of the team. So let's forget about that comparison, and we'll just assume I compared Arthur Smith to a lesser quarterback than Kirk Cousins. But Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan are the Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen, right? When it comes to play calling, right? We're winning because of you. And sort of, where is Zac Robinson? Are we getting a Dak Prescott? And I know some of you guys are like, Dak sucks, but for those of you that don't know and don't watch enough football, Dak is the engine that drives the Cowboys offense. He's just not as good an engine as Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes. He's basically a V6 as opposed to a V8 engine. I'm not a car guy, but it's if you don't like the quarterback analogy, we'll just use engine analogies. it's like we want Zac Robinson to be a V8, right? Or a Hemi or whatever the top of the line engine is, right? But, we'll settle for a V6. That's better than what we had, which was like a V4. My Hyundai Elantra is that sort of V4 engine. So I'm very well versed with the lack of horsepower, that your offense has. But that's how you have to kind of think of it, right? That horsepower is going to fuel the acceleration of your car. It's going to fuel the ceiling and the potential of your offense. And to me, it's going to be a huge factor if this Falcons team makes the playoffs. How good is Zac Robinson at dialing up those explosive plays? Because, we'll get into this more on today's episode. I'm not expecting the Falcons to hit the ground running early in this season from an offensive standpoint, right? But if Zac Robinson is that dude as a play caller, it may mean that in the second half of the season, when things start to click, when we get to October, November, et cetera, when the schedule gets a little bit easier during that point, we might see this offense really firing on all cylinders. And I'm not suggesting that we're going to go on a Super Bowl run, but it kind of could be similar to that 2016 team where they were really hot down the stretch, right? Firing on all cylinders. That team finished the season 5-1, averaging about 37 points a game after their bye week. And I'm wondering, could we see something similar to the Falcons this year where we might be hovering, my expectation is we probably be hovering around or just below 500 when we get to the bye week this year, and we might be in a position where we have to go 4-2 or 5-1 in those last 6 games after the bye in order to make the playoffs, right? And so you want your offense to be, that sort of driving element to take advantage of maybe some softer matchups and softer defenses that you're not going to necessarily get at the beginning of the season. But that is a conversation that we'll have to see about. That's a conversation that kind of lends to itself to the sense of urgency, right, that this team needs to be playing at. And that will get us to a conversation of, whether or not we should be playing guys in the preseason. Will that sort of, fire up the engine a little bit earlier? And so we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables when your schedule is packed with kids' activities or big work projects and so much more? It's easy to let your priorities slip. It's hard to make time for things, and even those things that we know make us happy. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Therapy has taught me positive coping skills, like you can only control what you can control. So when the Falcons visit with Justin Simmons and don't sign him, I can cope with that. Maybe others are struggling with that. And so maybe you should think about getting some therapy, right? So you can learn those positive coping skills. And BetterHelp is a great resource. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire, get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So before we get started talking a little bit more about, a big day of practice and the sense of urgency, and does that lead us to questions about preseason, I do want to plug, whether you believe in playing guys in the preseason or not, there is some benefit to guys getting looks in the preseason because it helps us with our fantasy drafts. Who's actually looking to hit the ground running or not? Check out Locked On Fantasy Football. They're giving you the scoop on some sleepers, some risers, some fallers, all that and more. It's part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we got another tweet from Joe Patrick of 92.9 The Game that is sort of our launching off point into the next part of this conversation, which is, he says, one of the more emotionally intense Falcon practices of camp today as they work through live 2-minute drills. Players and coaches invested in it like it's a game. And that's very good to hear coming off of this Miami game. This is music to my ears, right? This is my number one concern with the team. Do they have the correct sense of urgency heading into the season? And it's not to suggest that they lack the sense of urgency, but basically they need to have a sense of urgency. And, that's the question, right? And Kirk Cousins commented on this today after practice on Wednesday. And this is one of the things I've very much enjoyed about Kirk Cousins being on the team and talking to the media, being that sort of grown up that's been around the block for a long time, understanding how and when and the ways to push this team to try to get better every single day, because he does understand that sort of sense of urgency of, the goal is to win, that competitive drive and all that sort of thing. And, that's reflected in the coaching points that he's given Kyle Pitts that myself and Jarvis Davis talked about last week on the pod, talking about pushing Kyle to run every route, all out and all that sort of things. And, he's commented multiple times about the preseason where, he would like to play the preseason, and thinks there's value to it. But, this goes back with talking about Kirk, at the end of last year, where we talked about this around Christmas and talking about what are the Falcons' plans for the offseason, and one of the lessons I thought that the Falcons may carry over into the offseason that they would learn from the 2023 season is that the sort of stability and consistency you saw on the defensive side of the ball. I think you could attribute a lot of that to having veterans on that side of the ball to kind of stabilize things. And I thought that they would try to do the same thing on offense, particularly at the quarterback position. And one of the reasons why I thought the team would target someone like a Kirk Cousins over a Justin Fields. The reason I bring that up, guys, is because I got one thing wrong, or technically we'll see. If they don't sign Justin Simmons, then I will absolutely claim that I got that one right. But you know me. But because I got one thing wrong, I have to remind you guys all the things I got right. And so we're going to remind you guys of the Kirk Cousins over Justin Fields and Russell Wilson stuff on my illustrious track record. My ego will not allow me to acknowledge being wrong, for more than 24 hours. But, I think that's part of the reason why my expectations for the defense are a little bit lower, right? Just because they have so many unproven guys on that side of the ball. And so I don't think it's going to be as stable as it was a year ago where they were consistently good week in and week out, right? And I think hopefully Kirk is going to add that stability on the offensive side of the ball. But you want to see this team with a sense of urgency, right? Because this schedule is so front-loaded. The first 5 games are going to be some of the toughest matchups they're going to have this year. And we've discussed this several times where Kirk Cousins historically doesn't play his best ball in September. He doesn't play poorly in September, but generally speaking, there is an uptick in play from Kirk in October and November and beyond. Because of the way the schedule is structured, I don't know if the Falcons can really afford to get off to a slower start in September, because that will put them behind the 8 ball. And, even though the schedule does theoretically get easier, you never know what's going to happen as a season wears on, where, injuries can accumulate and whatnot. And so you're probably not going to be as healthy come November, December as you were in September. And so you need to take advantage of all those opportunities that are presented to you. And that gets us to the whole, should guys play in the preseason? And like Kirk, I do think there is value to guys playing in the preseason. I don't think it's the end all be all, but I think there is value to it. But it's basically whatever that value is, you're measuring it up against the injury risk of, the more that you play these guys, the more exposed to injuries. And we saw that front and center on Friday night down in Miami. But for those of you that are everydayers for multiple years, that it was very critical of Arthur Smith's decision to not play guys, the starters in the preseason back in 2021 in his first year. I have not really commented on it with Raheem, but I'll just go on the record. I'm not going to be as critical of Raheem doing that. Again, I would prefer to see guys, but it ain't, you can only control what you can control, right? So it ain't out of my control. But it's different to me, because one of the main reasons why I felt so they needed to play guys was in part due to the presence of a rookie in Kyle Pitts, who was going to be such a huge factor in that offense in 2021. He needed the reps, right? And even if you were basically we're not going to play Matt Ryan because we don't want to risk injury to him, you should have been more willing to play Kyle Pitts more than 5 snaps, even injury risk be damned. You just needed to get those reps in him. And the difference is this year's offense especially has a lot more NFL experience. They're still young at a lot of these positions, with Pitts and London, and et cetera, and Bijan and whatnot, but they don't need the reps to the same degree that I thought that team needed the reps, where, you really need to see what Kyle Pitts had to do. You really kind of need to see what that offensive line could wind up doing as well, given that you had Matt Hennessy and Jalen Mayfield, first-year starters, and certainly you could argue Lindstrom and McGarry could have used the reps as well. But anyway, for me, as I said, you got to weigh the injury risk. The injury risk was a serious issue to the point that it didn't. Friday night wasn't oh no, this is a problem. It was that was an issue, and now that issue is more at the forefront now. But I felt this way before, where it's like, to me, this is different this year. The math is different this year because I think the injury risk outweighs the need for all these young key core pieces to get reps like it was in 2021. So while I still think there's value to playing in the preseason, I'm not going to be like Raheem is making a terrible decision. But to me, at least a worthwhile conversation, right? Because, to me, it's less about, if they play guys in the preseason, they'll get off to a fast start versus if they don't or whatever. I don't think that's really true. But it is one of those things, again, I think there is value to playing guys in the preseason. But like when we talk about teams that don't play guys in the preseason, we talk about the McVay disciples, and it's seemingly very clear that Raheem is falling on the side of traditional McVay disciples of not playing guys in the preseason. He hasn't basically come out and said it, but he has basically very strongly hinted that we're not going to see any starters at any point during the preseason. But what's interesting about McVay is, like, McVay doesn't play starters in the preseason, and slow starts are a non-issue for the Rams, right? They've averaged 30 points per game in the month of September since McVay's arrival there. That's the second most in that span since 2017. But you compare that to, say, Zach Taylor's Bengals, who is a McVay disciple. They don't play the starters, but the Bengals typically start slow, right? Where if you go back the last 3 years, and that's the 3 years with the Bengals have been good with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, they're only averaging about 21 points per game in the month of September. And during that span, that's like 22nd in the league. So to me, one of the questions I have, and again, I don't know if this is going to be definitively decided by whether or not we play guys in the preseason, because obviously both the Rams and Bengals do, and they get wildly different results. But like, are we going to be more like the Rams and start fast, or are we going to be more like the Bengals? And it's going to take until like week 5 or week 6, like we've seen with the Bengals in recent years, before they really hit their stride. And some of that last year was owed to Joe Burrow being hurt and whatnot. And we Falcon fans personally experienced the game the previous year where the Bengals finally hit their stride, where they were kind of struggling, and then we played them week 6, and they put the hurting on us. But I think a lot of the Falcons' ability to start fast this year is going to depend on Zac Robinson's play calling. I think a lot of it's going to depend on the offensive line and the run game coming out and performing well early, especially against some high-level defensive lines in those first couple of games. So we'll just sort of have to see how the Falcons perform. But certainly, I think it was a worthwhile time to have that conversation about the sort of preseason, due to, the sort of sense of urgency that you like to see in the Falcons daily. And so going back to really the larger point of, like, it's nice to see the Falcons trying to replicate that sense of urgency. If you're not going to get the reps in the preseason, we want to see them have that urgency in practice daily. And we want to continue to hear, man, this was the best practice day for such and such a player. The Falcons played with a lot of emotion, all those various things coming out of these practice reports on the daily for the rest of training camp. So we'll see if we get that, but we'll have enough talking about, or at least we'll finish most of our conversation about the offense. We'll probably have a couple more little tidbits about the offense, like offensive line play, but let's turn our attention to the defense, and especially talking about the potential of Brandon Dorlus being one of the Falcons' solutions to their problems looking for pass rush at edge. And we'll do that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, it is summer, and the sports aren't always sporting like we want them to, but FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a daily boost or bonus. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Just head over to FanDuel.com and you can make the most out of your summer. And whether you want to bet on this weekend's upcoming preseason action, or you want to bet on the upcoming, NFL week 1 action, you're feeling good about the sense of urgency that the Falcons showed in practice, and you feel really good about them being favored in that week 1 matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers, head on over to FanDuel and check it out. As well as, if you're not getting your sports fix, well, FanDuel, of course, is, an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball, and the Braves are doing their thing. Or maybe you're not feeling what the Braves are doing. Maybe you're not feeling how they're going to finish in October. You can go check that out over at FanDuel.com to make the most out of your summer. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. So we have another tweet from Josh Kendall, sort of summarizing today's practice. He says, a big day for London Deep, one great catch. Charlie Warner leaping 45-yard touchdown over Jesse Bates. Parker Hesse could never, and I could never say those words out loud. Avery Williams got second-team reps at running back. Andrew Stuber took some first-team reps at right tackle. Newish wide receiver Jesse Matthews popped with the third team, and Brandon Dorlus got a few snaps at defensive end. So, Avery Williams had a great blitz pickup at Friday night in Miami in an A gap. And, I think we talked about this last week with Rondell Moore's injury and the potential that he might move to running back because his skill set is much more like a running back than a true wide receiver, and talked about the struggles of a sub 190-pound running backs. And that is this big struggle. It's the pass protection where you're trying to block 230-pound linebackers through the A gap or a 260-pound edge coming off the edge. If you're giving up, 40 pounds or 70 pounds to those guys, it's going to be a problem. And this is why, I've always liked Avery Williams because he plays a little bit bigger than he is. And why, we're big fans of Avery Williams here on the podcast because, again, three things that matter: Black lives, special teams, and, explosive plays. And someone's going to be like, all phases matter. But anyway, the other tidbit that Josh tweeted out about Andrew Stuber is notable to me because I wasn't blown away by his film in the Miami game, but I think he did look of the second string offensive line, Julian Davenport, Kyle Hinton, Javon Gwynn, Andrew Stuber, and Storm Norton that started that game. I would say that Stuber probably was one of the better guys in that unit. And I think this is a promising sign for him. He started the game at right guard, and then I think he started working at right tackle with the third or fourth string O-line there. And you guys know that I'm not particularly happy with the offensive line depth, right? Like Newsel, Norton are fine. They've shown what they can do on a football field, but nobody so far is shown that they're worthy of the 8th spot or possibly 9th spot of the offensive line. And right now, Stuber is the front runner. So this is a promising sign for him. I was a little disappointed with Javon Gwynn. Didn't necessarily see the year 2 jump in the Miami game that I wanted to see. Maybe he or others will show that this weekend against Baltimore. But the last tidbit is the one that we're going to spend the bulk of the remainder of today's episode talking about. That is Brandon Dorlus moving out to D end or edge. Goes back to a conversation we had yesterday talking about Zach Harrison's potential to move out there. And basically, what are my thoughts on it? It's the same conversation, guys, right? As we discussed when we broke down Dorlus's film, I do think Dorlus's ideal role, if in a vacuum, I would say the ideal role for him is on a defense with a 4-man front, where on early downs he plays defensive end, right? And then on third downs, passing downs, kicks inside as a defensive tackle. And the value of that type of role is you get the sort of beef on rundowns on early downs so that you can play with light boxes, so you can keep those two safeties deep so that they can guard against the explosive plays that, matter, right? When teams love to dial up those play action shots down the field on first and second down. And so you have to play with light boxes so that those safeties can prevent the explosive plays, but you still have to be able to stop the run because teams generally tend to run the ball a lot more on early downs than they do on, third downs and whatnot. And so you get that sort of beef on the outside so that you can play with those lighter boxes and stop the run. And then obviously on passing downs, you kick that guy inside because he's much more of a mismatch as a pass rusher going up against guards than he is against tackles. And this is why, I tend to be a little bit more skeptical of Harrison and Dorlus as pure edges, because I don't know if there's solutions to your problem because they don't really have the speed or bend or burst to me that are going to really give offensive tackles problems as pass rushers outside on the edge, right? They're more mismatch guys for guards on the interior. And then, so what's the point of them being on the outside? Okay, well, they can add value as run defenders, right? But are they really adding a whole lot more in that arena than Lorenzo Carter or James Smith-Williams are? I don't think so, right? Zach Harrison was a very good run defender, but both he and Lorenzo Carter finished top 10 last year among edge rushers, according to PFF's run stop metric last year. So to me, the only real reason to play Dorlus, or at least to give Dorlus extended run at, on the outside, is just simply you just prefer to see those young guys get those reps as opposed to the veterans that what they are, right? But I don't think, that's fine. But I don't think that's a solution to the Falcons' current problem, which is, we need to get more than adequate pass rush from the outside at that edge rusher position. So, this is the time of year where you can kind of throw stuff at a wall and give Dorlus some reps and see what sticks, but, that's one of the benefits of the preseason training camp. None of it matters, I guess you could say. So you can do that type of stuff, but to me, this isn't necessarily a signal oh, this is going to solve our problems. That's what I would say. I would say pump the brakes on that because, I think at best it's a lateral move. But again, if you just want to get the young guys reps and see what they have rather than the older guys, then so be it. But those are my thoughts on that. We'll see if Justin Simmons signs, but more than likely we'll be talking with Jarvis Davis about what we expect to see on Saturday against the Baltimore Ravens. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. All you got to do is subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On Fantasy Football, Locked On Sports Atlanta. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.